I was once a mother with 12 children, ignorant in terms of education, far from beautiful, particularly in the later years, with a wild temper and raucous voice. This was around Jerusalem in the 6th century. The children had many fathers. I did my best to provide for them. My name was Marshaba. We lived wherever we could, squatting in doorways, and finally all begging. Yet in that existence, physical life had a contrast, a sharpness greater than any I had known. A crust of bread was far more delicious to me than any piece of cake, however well frosted, had ever been in lives before. When my children laughed, I was overwhelmed with delight, and despite our privations, each morning was a triumphant surprise that we had not died in our sleep, that we had not succumbed to starvation. I chose that life deliberately, as each of you choose each of yours, and I did so because my previous lives had left me too blasé. I was too cushioned. I no longer focused with clarity upon the truly spectacular physical delights and experiences that Earth can provide. Though I yelled at my children and screamed sometimes in rage against the elements, I was struck through with the magnificence of existence, and I learned more about true spirituality than I ever did as a monk. This does not mean that poverty leads to truth, or that suffering is good for the soul. Many who shared those conditions with me learned little. It does mean that each of you choose those life conditions that you have for a purpose, knowing ahead of time where your weaknesses and strengths lie. In the gestalt of my personality, as in your terms I lived later, richer lives, that woman was alive in me again, as for example the child is alive in the adult and filled with gratitude comparing later circumstances to the earlier existences. She urged me to use my advantages better. So in you, your various reincarnational existences in a large manner co-occur. Using the analogy of adulthood again, it is as if the child within you is a part of your own memory and experience, and yet in another way has left you, gone apart from you, as if you were only one adult that the child quote-unquote turned into. So the people that I have been have gone their own way, and yet are a part of me, and I of them. I am alive in Seth's 2 memory, as a self from which he sprang. Yet the self I am now is not the self from which he sprang. Only your rigid ideas of time and consciousness make these statements seem strange to you, for in a larger context, again, I can remember Seth 2. All of these connections, therefore, are open. All psychological events affect all others. All of existence and consciousness is interwoven. Only when you think of the soul as something different, separate, and therefore closed, are you led to consider a separate God, a personality that seems to be apart from creation. All that is a part of creation, but more than what creation is. There are pyramid gestalts of being impossible to describe, whose awareness includes knowledge and experience of what would seem to be to you a vast number of other realities. In the terms of which I am speaking for your benefit, their present might, for example, include the life and death of your planet in a moment of their time. Seth 2's existence is at the outer fringes of one such galaxy of consciousness. When Seth 2 speaks, Rupert initially is aware of the following. His consciousness strains upward, following an inner psychic pathway, an energized funnel, until quite simply it can go no further. It seems to him then that his consciousness goes out of his body through an invisible pyramid whose open top stretches far up into space. Here he seems to make contact with impersonal symbols whose message is somehow automatically translated into words. That point actually represents a warp in dimensions, a space between systems that has far more to do with energy and psychological reality than it has to do with space, for space is meaningless. I am almost always present as a translator at such times. My knowledge of both realities is necessary for the communication. Seth 2 is familiar with an entirely different set of symbols and meanings, so that, in this case, 2 translations are being given, one by me and one by Rupert. Hopefully, certain concepts will be delivered in this way that could not be delivered otherwise. These minglings of reality and experience, these messages from one system to another, occur in various ways continually, emerging in your world in one guise or another, as inspiration of many kinds. You are being helped, in other words. You are also using your own abilities, however, for your own characteristics largely determine the amount of help you receive. The symbolism apparent to Rupert when Seth 2 speaks works well, but outward is also inward, and so consciousness travels as far inward as it seems to him to go outward. Such context and knowledge are available to each individual. All that is speaks to all of its parts, not with sounds, trumpets, and fanfare from without, but communicates its messages through the living soul stuff of each consciousness. You are not fated to dissolve into all that is. The aspects of your personality as you presently understand them will be retained. All that is the creator of individuality, not the means of its destruction. My own quote-unquote previous personalities are not dissolved into me any more than your quote-unquote past personalities. All are living and vital. All go their own way. Your quote-unquote future personalities are as real as your past ones. After a while, this will no longer concern you. Out of the reincarnational framework, there is no death as you think of it. My own frame of reference, however, is no longer focused on my reincarnational existences. I have turned my attention in other directions. Since all lives are simultaneously all happening at once, then any separation is a psychological one. I exist as I am, while my reincarnational lives, in your terms, still exist. Yet now I am not concerned with them, but turn my concentration into other areas of activity. Personality changes whether it is within a body or outside of it, so you will change after death as you change before it. In those terms, it is ridiculous to insist upon remaining as you are now after death. It is the same as a child saying, "I am going to grow up, but I am never going to change the ideas that I have now." The multidimensional qualities of the psyche allow it to experience an endless realm of dimensions. Experience in one dimension in no way negates existence in another. You have been trying to squeeze the soul into tight concepts of the nature of existence, making it follow your limited beliefs. The door to the soul is open, and it leads to all dimensions of experience. If you think, however, that the self as you know it is the end or summation of yourself, then you also imagine your soul to be a limited entity bound by its present ventures in one life alone, to be judged accordingly after death on the performance of a few paltry years. In many ways this is a cozy concept, though to some it can be quite frightening with its connotations of eternal damnation. It is far too tidy an idea, however, to hint at the rich embellishments that are at the heart of divine creativity. The soul stands both within and without the fabric of physical life as you know it. You are not separated from the animals and the rest of existence by virtue of possessing an eternal inner consciousness. Such a consciousness is present within all living beings and in all forms. Now, I titled this chapter A Goodbye and an Introduction. The goodbye is my own, since I am now finishing this book. The introduction applies to each reader, for I hope that you will now be able to meet yourself face to face with a greater understanding of who and what you are. I would like, therefore, to introduce you to yourself. You will not find yourself by running from teacher to teacher, from book to book. You will not meet yourself through following any particular specialized method of meditation. Only by looking quietly within the self that you know can your own reality be experienced, with those connections that exist between the present or immediate self and the inner identity that is multidimensional. There must be a willingness, an acquiescence, a desire. If you do not take the time to examine your own subjective states, then you cannot complain if so many answers seem to elude you. You cannot throw the burden of proof upon another, or expect a man or teacher to prove to you the validity of your own existence. Such a procedure is bound to lead you into one subjective trap after another. As you sit reading this book, the doorways within are open. You have only to experience the moment as you know it as fully as possible, as it exists physically within the room or outside in the streets of the city in which you live. Imagine the experience present in one moment of time over the globe. Then try to appreciate the subjective experience of your own that exists in the moment and yet escapes it, and this multiplied by each living individual. This exercise alone will open your perceptions, increase your awareness, and automatically expand your appreciation of your own nature. The quote-unquote you who is capable of such expansion must be a far more creative and multidimensional personality than you earlier imagined. Many of the suggested small exercises given earlier in the book will also help you become acquainted with your own reality, will give you direct experience with the nature of your own soul or entity, and will put you in contact with those portions of your being from which your own vitality springs. You may or may not have your own encounters with past reincarnational selves or probable selves. You may or may not catch yourselves in the act of changing levels of consciousness. Certainly most of my readers, however, will have success with some of the suggested exercises. They are not difficult, and they are within the capabilities of all. Each reader, however, should in one way or another sense his own vitality in a way quite new to him, and find avenues of expansion opening within himself, of which he was earlier unaware. The very nature of this book, the method of its creation and delivery, in themselves should clearly point out the fact that human personality has far more abilities than those usually ascribed to it. By now you should understand that all personalities are not physically materialized. As this book was conceived and written by a non-physical personality and then made physical, so do each of you have access to greater abilities and methods of communication than those usually accepted. I hope that in one way or another this book of mine has served to give each of you an introduction to the inner multidimensional identity that is your own. And that, my dear friend, is the end of dictation, and the book is finished.